Welcome to On English Speak Through Stories, Chapter 1, The Two Sisters. It was the year 1757. The place was the dangerous and wild land west of the Hudson River. It was the third year of the war in North America. The war was between England and France. Each country wanted the land for itself. Indian tribes had always lived in that land. In the war, some tribes were fighting for the French, while other tribes were fighting for the English. Fort Edward was on the Hudson River. General Webb was the commander of the English army at Fort Edward. He was waiting for news of General Montcalm, who was the commander of the French army. The news came one morning. An Indian called Magua arrived and said the French army was coming toward Fort William Henry. General Webb was told about Fort William Henry, which was 15 miles away. It was at the south end of Lake George. How many men were among them? Asked Webb. As many as the leaves on the trees, said Magua. General Monroe wanted more soldiers at Fort William Henry. I will send 1,500 men, said General Webb. General Monroe was the commander of the English army at Fort William Henry. He had two daughters, Cora and Alice. Cora was about 23 years old, and Alice was 18. Cora had dark hair and a beautiful face. Alice had fair hair and blue eyes. These two young women were at Fort Edward, but they were going to travel to Fort William Henry. They were going to meet their father. General Webb spoke to Cora and Alice. Magua knows a secret path through the forest, said General Webb. He will be your guide. Magua and Major Duncan Hayward will take you to Fort William Henry. Major Duncan Hayward was a young English officer. He and the two young women left Fort Edward. They rode on horses in front of them. Alice watched Magua. I liked him, Cora said. What do you think? Will it be safe in the forest with Magua? We must trust Magua, said Cora. The French knew our soldiers' path, said Duncan, but Magua's path was secret. He smiled at Alice, and she smiled at him. Duncan Hayward was in love with Alice. Magua is a Huron, said Duncan, but he lived with the Mohawks. The Mohawks are friends of the English. Magua came to us through your father. Duncan stopped, then he said, but I don't remember the whole story. Duncan knew more about Magua, but he did not tell Cora and Alice. He did not say, a few years ago, your father's men beat Magua. Now Magua hates your father. Duncan did not want to frighten the young women, so they followed Magua through the forest. Chapter 2, Lost in the Forest. A few miles west of Fort Edward, three men were sitting near a river. Two of the men were Indians, the other was a white man. Chingachgook and his son, Uncas, were Mohicans. The white man was a scout called Hawkeye. Hawkeye had a long hunting gun. The three men were talking. My tribe is the oldest Indian tribe, Chingachgook said. The blood of the Mohican chiefs is in me. Many summers ago, my tribe came here to the land of the Delawares. Where are the Mohicans now? Asked Hawkeye. Where are the flowers of those summers? Said Chingachgook. Gone. All dead. After my death, Uncas will be the last of the Mohicans. Suddenly, they heard a noise. They turned quickly. Hawkeye lifted his gun. Who is it? He said. Duncan Hayward rode out of the forest. Cora and Alice followed him. I am an English officer, Duncan said. We have come from Fort Edward. Edward, how far is it to Fort William Henry? Hawker laughed. At Fort William Henry? You are going the wrong way, he said. You are near Glens Falls. The wrong way, said Duncan. Then we got lost, but our Indian guide. You have an Indian guide, but you are lost in the forest, said Hawker. That is very strange. He is a Delaware. He is called Magma. He is a Huron, said Duncan, but he lives with the Mohawks, and he is a guide for them." "A Huron?" said Hawker quickly. "You can trust a Mohican or a Delaware, but you cannot trust a Huron. Your guide will lead you to his friends, they will kill you." "Let me see him." Magma was standing behind Cora's horse. Hawker looked at him. Then he went and spoke to Chingachgook and Uncas. Magma moved quickly, he ran into the forest. Hawker, Chingachgook, and Uncas ran after him, but Magma escaped. "What can I do?" thought Duncan. "We are lost." He turned to Hawker. "Will you take us to Fort William Henry?" he asked. "We will give you money." Hawker looked at Cora and Alice. "We will take you," he told Duncan. "Money is not important. We will not leave you and the two young women here. Magma and his Huron friends will find you. Come now, quickly." Duncan and Hawker spoke to Cora and Alice. The sisters got off their horses. The Mohicans took the animals away. "They will hide the horses until the morning," said Hawker. He pulled a canoe from the tall grass at the side of the river. "Get into the canoe," he said. "We will go to a cave, and we will stay there tonight." Duncan, Cora, and Alice got into the canoe. Hawker pushed the canoe to the middle of the river. Then he got into the canoe. He started to paddle along the river. Soon they heard the sound of a great waterfall in front of them. Glens Falls. A few minutes later, they saw the waterfall. A few minutes later, Hawkeye came back with Chingachgook, and the scout led everybody to a cave behind the waterfall. The cave was deep, narrow, and dark. Hawkeye immediately made a fire. Alice looked at the tall young Mohican, Uncas. "A strong man is guarding us," she said quietly to her sister. "We will be safe tonight." Chapter 3, The Fight at Glens Falls. Hawkeye woke Duncan early the next morning. "We must go," he said. "I will get the canoe. Wake Miss Cora and Miss Alice, but do not make any noise." Duncan went to the back of the cave. "Cora, Alice," he said quietly. "Wake up." Suddenly, there were shouts and cries outside. Duncan ran to the front of the cave. The sound of guns came from the forest. There were many Indians on the other side of the river. "Hurons," thought Duncan. Then Duncan saw Hawkeye. The scout was shooting from the flat rock. Duncan saw a Huron fall into the rushing water. Then the other Hurons ran back into the forest. Hawkeye came back into the cave. "They have gone," he said. "Will they come back?" asked Duncan. "Yes, they will come back," replied Hawkeye. "Miss Cora and Miss Alice must stay here in the cave. We will go to the rocks and wait for the Hurons." Duncan, Hawkeye, Uncas, and Chingachgook sat with their guns. They sat behind some rocks near the waterfall. They waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour passed. Suddenly, they heard the wild cries of the Hurons again. 4 Indians ran across the flat rock towards the cave. They fired their guns. The first 2 Hurons fell to the ground. The third Huron jumped on Hawkeye. Each man had a knife, but Hawkeye was stronger than the Huron. He killed the Huron with his knife. The fourth Huron fought with Duncan. Bunks ran to help the officer. The young Mohican was killed and hurt. Then Inks and Duncan ran back to the rocks. The Huron on the other side of the river started to shoot again. And Chink shot at them. The shooting went on and on. Rocks and trees near the cave were broken in 100 places, but the Hawker and his friends were not hurt, and Cora and Alice were safe in the cave. The Hawker saw a Huron in a tree on the other side of the river. The scout lifted his long gun and fired. There was a cry, and the Indian fell from the tree. "I have no more bullets," said the Hawker. Go to the canoe. There are some bullets in the canoe. Inks ran quickly across the flat rock, but he was too late. A Huron was pushing the canoe across the river. Duncan, the hawker, and the two Mohicans went back to the cave. "What can we do now?" asked Duncan. The hawker thought for a few minutes. "There will be guards on the paths," he said. "The Huron will watch every path. We must swim. We must jump into the river. The rushing water will take us past the Huron." The scout looked at Cora and Alice. "We cannot swim," said Cora. "Alice and I will stay here. Go to General Monroe at Fort William Henry. General Monroe must send soldiers." The hawker talked quietly together. Then Chink ran out of the cave and jumped into the river. A moment later, the hawker put down his long gun and followed Chink. The rushing water took them away. Cora looked at Inks. "Go with them," she said. "I will stay," said the young Mohican. "No," said Cora. "Please, Inks, go with them." Inks was unhappy. But he jumped into the water too. Cora looked at Duncan. "I am going to stay," said Duncan. He looked at Alice. "I cannot leave you." There were shouts and cries from the Huron on the flat rock. Duncan looked out of the cave. The Huron were looking behind the rocks near the waterfall. "They were looking for us," thought Duncan. He went quickly back into the cave. "Our friends would bring help soon," he said to Cora and Alice. Cora was afraid, her face was white. She cried out. Duncan turned, and he saw the terrible face of Magua. "Where are the Mohicans?" asked Magua. "Where is the scout Hawkeye, the long gun?" Suddenly, the cave was full of Huron. One of them picked up Hawkeye's gun. "They have gone," said Duncan. "They will bring help soon." The Huron were angry. They were going to kill their prisoners, but Magua spoke to them quickly and quietly. Then the Huron took Duncan, Cora, and Alice to the flat rock. One of the Huron brought the canoe. "Get into the canoe," Magua said. Duncan and the sisters got into the canoe. Magua and the Huron took them across the river. The prisoners got out of the canoe on the other side of the river. Magua and 5 Huron stayed with them. The other Huron walked away into the forest. Chapter 4, I Am a Huron Chief. The Huron and their prisoners started to walk. Magua walked in front of Duncan, Cora, and Alice. The other Huron walked behind the prisoners. They walked across a valley. Then Magua led them up a steep hill. The land at the top of the hill was flat. Magua sat down under a tree. The Hurons started to eat and drink. Magua shouted to Duncan. "Send the dark-haired woman to me." Cora was afraid she would go to Magma. "What do you want?" she asked. "I am a Huron chief," said Magus. "I lived 20 summers and 20 winters. I did not see a white man. I was happy. Then a white man came into the forest. He gave me brandy. The drink was bad for me. It made me crazy. My people were angry. I had to go away. I ran away and lived with the Mohawks. Then the war started. Magma. The French and the English were fighting each other. The Mohawks were fighting for the English. The Huron were fighting for the French. I was fighting my own people. Your father Monroe was our chief. He told the Mohawks, do not drink brandy. But a white man gave me brandy. What did Monroe do? He gave orders to his men. They tied me with ropes, and they beat me. I will never forget. But, said Cora. Woman, shouted Magus. He stood up quickly. You will be my wife. Your sister will go to Fort William Henry. She must tell Monroe everything. Then Monroe will know his daughter lives with me. Magus, never, said Cora. I will not be your wife. Magus smiled. Then you will die, he said, and your friends will die too. Then Magus went towards the other Huron. He spoke to them. Duncan ran to Cora. What is wrong? He asked. What did Magus say to you? It is not important, said Cora. The Huron were listening to Magus. Duncan watched them. They were very angry. Suddenly, Magus shouted at the Huron. They pulled Duncan and the women towards the trees. They tied each prisoner to a tree with rope. Magus stood in front of Cora. He laughed. What does Monroe's daughter say now? He said. Shall I send your sister to your father? Will you follow me to the Great Lakes and live with me? Cora looked at her sister. Alice said to Cora, I must go with Magua and be his wife. Then you and Duncan will live. No, shouted Duncan. Never. No, 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 said Alice. Then die, shouted Magua. He threw his knife at Alice. The knife cut off some of her hair. It hit the tree above her head. Duncan shouted angrily. The Hurons had tied Duncan to a tree, but he pulled the rope, and it broke. He jumped on a Huron, and they fought. The Huron had a knife. He was going to kill Duncan. Suddenly, a gun fired, and the Huron fell dead. Chapter 5, Fort William Henry. Hawkeye ran from the forest. Chingachgook and Uncas followed him. There was a fight between Hawkeye, Uncas, and Duncan. They killed 4 Hurons. Chingachgook jumped on Magua. The Mohican stabbed Magua with his knife. Magua fell to the ground. Hawkeye and Duncan went and helped the 2 women. But Magua was not dead. He got up and ran away. Chingachgook and Uncas ran after him. Stop, shouted Hawkeye. You cannot catch him. Hawkeye, how did you find us? Duncan asked. We waited at the side of the river, said Hawkeye. We saw the Hurons take you across the river. Then we followed you. You saved my life, said Duncan. Hawkeye smiled. I found a Huron's gun, he said. The Hurons were stupid. They left their guns under the trees. Hawkeye went back to the trees. He picked up the other guns. He found his own long gun. Now we have guns and bullets, he said. We will stay here tonight. Tomorrow we will go to Fort William Henry. Very early the next morning, Hawkeye woke his friends. He led them across the valley and along a path through the forest. They stopped near a small river. We would walk in the water, said Hawkeye, then Magus would not see our footprints on the ground. They walked in the river for an hour, then they came to some mountains, walking quietly. Now, said Hawkeye, there are French soldiers here. They walked to the top of a mountain and looked down. There was Lake George, and there was Fort William Henry. Smoke came from fires in the forest. Look at the fires, said Hawkeye. There are many Hurons in the forest. They were fighting for the French. And look to the west, said Duncan. Look at those tents, that is General Montcalm's camp. There were thousands of French soldiers. Suddenly, they heard the sound of guns. The French were shooting at the fort. William Henry said to Duncan, but we must get into the fort. We are lucky, said Hawkeye. Thick fog was coming down the valley. The fog would hide us from the French. Follow me. Hawkeye and the Mohicans started to walk down the mountain. Duncan and the 2 sisters followed them. At the bottom of the mountain, the fog was very thick. Be careful, said Hawkeye. There are many French soldiers along this path, walk quietly. They followed him through the fog. Suddenly, they heard voices. "Who is there?" said a soldier in French. Duncan replied in French, "A friend of France," he said. "Who are you?" shouted the Frenchman. But Duncan and his friends walked away quickly. They went on through the fog. At last, they arrived at the walls of the fort. An English voice shouted from the top of the wall, "The French are here. Shoot! Shoot! Father! Father!" Alice shouted. "It is us. Save your daughters." "Don't shoot, men," said the voice of General Monroe. "My daughters are here. Open the gates." The gates opened. Soldiers came out of the fort. They took everybody inside, Duncan, the young women, Hawkeye, and the Mohicans, but everybody in Fort William Henry was in danger. Chapter 6, When Will Help Come? Days passed. The French army fired their big guns at Fort William. Many English soldiers were killed. General Monroe waited, but General Webb did not send any soldiers. Monroe sent Hawkeye to Fort Edward with a message. General Webb gave Hawkeye a letter for Monroe. The scout started to go back to Fort William Henry, but the French soldiers stopped him. They took the letter. They tied Hawkeye's hands with rope. The next morning, Duncan Hayward was standing by the gates of Fort William Henry. He saw 3 men coming towards the fort. He went to General Monroe. "General Monroe," he said, "2 French soldiers are at the gates of the fort. Hawkeye is with them. But when will help come from Fort Edward?" Hawkeye came into General Monroe's room. "General Webb gave me a letter for you," he said, "but the French soldiers took it. General Montcalm wants to speak to you. You must go to his camp." A French officer met Monroe and Duncan at the gates of the fort. They went to General Montcalm's tent in the French camp. There were French officers and Indian chiefs in the tent. Then Duncan saw Magua. Magua was fighting for the French. The Huron looked at Duncan and smiled. Montcalm spoke first. He spoke to Monroe. "You have fought well, General," he said, "but now you must stop fighting." Montcalm gave a letter to Monroe. Monroe read it quickly. Then he gave it to Duncan. The letter was from General Webb. The letter said, "We cannot send any more men. The Indians have killed too many of my soldiers." Monroe looked at Duncan. They did not speak. Then General Monks spoke to Monroe, "You and your soldiers must leave Fort William Henry." He said, "You can take your guns, but do not take your bullets. Your men, women, and children will be safe, but we will burn the fort." General Monroe was unhappy. "We will leave in the morning," he said. Then he and Duncan went back to the fort. Magua was angry. He spoke to the Huron chiefs. The English would leave the fort. The French would not kill them, but the English are the enemies of the Huron. We will kill the English. 3,000 English people, soldiers, women, and children, left the fort. They walked past the French soldiers and they walked towards the forest. The English soldiers carried their guns, but they had no bullets. Magua and the Huron were standing in the forest. They watched Fort William Henry. The English left the fort and walked into the forest. Then 2,000 Indians attacked the English. They could not fight. They had no bullets in their guns. Many of the English were killed. Alice and Cora saw their father. He was running towards the French camp. He was going to find monks. He was going to ask for help. "Father! Father!" shouted Alice. "We are here." But Monroe did not hear them. He did not stop. Magua was watching. He ran to Cora. "Will you come with me now?" he said. "Never," said Cora. "I will not be your wife." The Huron looked at her, but he did not speak. Then he turned to Alice. He held Alice's arms. He pulled her towards a horse. "Stop!" shouted Cora, and she ran after them. Magua put Alice on the horse. Then he put Cora on the horse, too. The Huron took them along a path towards Lake Hurricane. Chapter 7. 3 days had passed. William Henry had burnt down, the French soldiers had gone, the Indians had gone. The bodies of many English soldiers, women, and children lay on the ground in the evening. 5 men walked through the forest. Monroe, Duncan, Hawkeye, and Uncas were looking for Cora and Alice. They found the dead bodies of many English people. The 5 men were sad and angry. Suddenly, Uncas shouted to the others. He had a small piece of cloth in his hand that was a piece of Cora's dress. Monroe and Uncas found footprints on the ground near a tree. 3 people and a horse were standing there, he said. Then Chingachgook found Alice's necklace, and he found another piece of Cora's dress. Duncan took the necklace. He smiled. "Alice is alive," he said. "Miss Cora has left a trail," said Hawkeye. "She has left pieces of her dress. We can follow this trail, but we must go quietly. Magua is with them." "But it is late," said Hawkeye. "We will eat some food. We will sleep here tonight. Tomorrow we will follow Miss Cora's trail." Very early the next morning, Hawkeye woke the English officers and the Mohicans. The 5 men followed Cora's trail. It led them to Lake Hurricane. Uncas and Chingachgook found a canoe in the grass near the lake. The 5 men got into the canoe. The Mohicans paddled it along the lake. After half an hour, Uncas spoke quietly. "Smoke," he said. He was looking at a small island in front of him. "Smoke from a fire," said Hawkeye. "And there are 2 canoes." Suddenly, some herons ran from the trees on the island. They got into the 2 canoes. "They are following us," said Duncan. "Paddle faster." "No, stop paddling," said the hawker. "I will shoot them," and he lifted his long gun. He fired, and a Huron in the first canoe fell into the lake. The Hurons stopped their 2 canoes. They did not follow and started paddling again. The 5 men went on. They went north up the lake. Chapter 8, The Medicine Man. In the evening, the 5 men arrived at the north end of the lake. They got out of the canoe, and Inks and Chink carried it. They put it under some trees. "We have lost the trail," said Duncan. "Where shall we go?" "My Mohican friends know the path to the Hurons' village," said the hawker. "It is north of this place. That is where Magua is going. We will go north too." For 2 days, the men followed the path. They walked many miles. They arrived at the Hurons' village on the 2nd day. It was early evening. There were about 100 houses by a small lake. Hawker spoke to Chink and Inks. Then he spoke to Duncan and Monroe. "General Monroe, stay with Chink," said the hawker. "Stay in the forest. Duncan and I will go into the village. Inks, go up the hill to the west, watch the village. Come back quickly and tell us about the guards." An hour passed. The 4 men waited. Inks did not come back. Suddenly, Duncan spoke. "I have a plan," he said. "Hawker, give me your coat. I must not wear my red soldier's coat in the village. I will be a medicine man, a French doctor. I will speak French. I will walk through the village and go into the houses. The Hurons will not hurt a medicine man. I will find Alice and Cora." It was a dangerous plan. Duncan put on Hawkeye's coat. Then he walked into the Hurons' village. There was a large wooden building in front of him. It was the meeting house of the Huron chiefs. Duncan went inside. Some Huron chiefs were sitting together. They saw Duncan come in. One of the chiefs walked forward. His hair was gray, and he was tall and strong. He spoke to Duncan in the Huron language, but Duncan did not understand. "Do you speak French?" Duncan asked the Huron, who replied in French. "Why are you here?" he asked. "I am a doctor," said Duncan. "The King of France sent me if any Huron's ill." Suddenly, there were loud cries from the forest. The chiefs left the meeting house. Duncan followed them. More Hurons were coming into the village. There was a prisoner in front of them. It was, Chapter 9. In the Hurons' village was not afraid. The Hurons ran around him. They shouted. They pulled him towards the wooden building. Inks saw Duncan outside the building. "Hawker is safe, Inks," Duncan said quietly. Then the Hurons took Inks into the meeting house. Duncan walked through the village. He looked in the houses. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked any questions. But Duncan did not find Alice and Cora. He went back to the meeting house. He went inside. Inks was standing, and the chiefs were sitting. Duncan sat down too. He sat near the wall. Then another Huron came into the building. It was Magus. Magus did not see Duncan, but he saw Inks. He shouted, "Mohican, you must die." Magus was angry. He turned to the chiefs. "Many Hurons died at Glens Falls," he said. "This Mohican is our enemy." Magus and 2 Hurons took the young Mohican out of the meeting house. Then one of the chiefs spoke to Duncan. "Medicine man. The wife of one of my men is ill. She is sick. Can you make her well?" "Take me to the woman," said Duncan. He followed the chief out of the meeting house. They went towards a hill. There was a cave in the hill. Duncan saw a bear following them, but he was not afraid. Indians liked bears. They often had bears in their villages. Duncan followed the chief into the cave. The cave was large, and there were many rooms with stone walls. The chief took Duncan into one room. The sick woman was lying on the ground. Some other women were with her. Duncan looked at the sick woman. She was dying. He thought. The Huron chief was waiting and looked at Duncan. Duncan turned to the Huron chief. "I must look at this sick woman alone," he said. "My medicine is a secret. Go with these 4 women and wait outside." The chief and the 4 women left the cave. A few minutes later, the bear came into the cave. The bear made a loud noise. Duncan looked at the bear again. The bear made a loud noise. It walked towards Duncan. Suddenly, it took off its head. It was Hawkeye. Hawkeye was wearing a bear's skin. "What?" said Duncan. Then he laughed. "Why are you wearing a bear's skin?" he asked. "I found the bear's skin in a Huron's house," said Hawkeye. "Now the Hurons will not stop me. But tell me, where is Miss Alice? I have been unlucky. I have not found Alice or Cora, and Uncas is a prisoner of the Hurons." "Magua has taken Miss Cora to the village of the Delawares," said Hawkeye. "I heard 2 Hurons talking about her. Chingachgook and Monroe are safe in the forest." Then Hawkeye heard a noise. He looked over a stone wall. "Miss Alice is in the next room," he said. Duncan went into the next room. There were some blankets, clothes, and animal skins in the room, and there her hands and feet were tied with rope. Her face was white. She was afraid of Duncan. She said, "You are here." "Yes," said Duncan. He untied her hands and feet. "Where?" Corma asked Alice, "Where is my father?" "Your father is safe. He is with Chink," said Duncan and Corma. Alice asked again, "He is near here." "He is in another village," said Korma. "He is with the Delawares." Suddenly, somebody came into the room. It was Magus. Chapter 10. The bear. Magus looked at Duncan and Alice. He laughed and went towards them. Suddenly, the bear was in the room. It quickly held Magus. Magus could not move. He could not turn around. Duncan ran to the Huron. He tied Magus's arms, then he tied Magus's feet. Magus started to speak, but Duncan put a cloth into his mouth. Hawker took off the bear's head. "We have to go quickly," he said. "Alice, you should wear a blanket. You will be the sick Huron woman. Then you can leave the Hurons' village." Hawker put on the bear's head again. Alice put a blanket over her head. Duncan carried Alice out of the cave, and Hawker followed Duncan. The Huron chief was outside the cave. "I am taking the sick woman away," said Duncan. "I will take her to your house tomorrow." Hawker, Duncan, and Alice left the village. Then Hawker led Duncan and Alice to a path. "This path goes to a small river," Hawker said to them. "You will see a hill. The village of the Delawares is near the hill. You will be safe with the Delawares." "What are you going to do?" asked Duncan. "I must go back for inks," said Hawker. It was dark in the village of the Hurons. Were in their houses. They were asleep. Hawker was looking for ink. The scout was wearing the bear's skin. He looked at all the buildings. Then he saw two men outside a house. They were guards, but they were asleep. Hawker quietly went inside the house. Ink was lying on the floor. His hands and feet were tied with rope. Hawker took off the bear's head. Ink smiled at Hawker. He said quietly, the Hawker untied Angus's hands and feet. Then he took off the bear's skin, and the Hawker ran quickly from the village. "We would go to the Delawares' village," said Hawker. "Yes," said the Delawares are the children of my grandfather. They would help us. The next morning, the Huron went to get Incas. They were going to kill him. They found the bear's skin, but they did not find the Mohican. Then they went to the cave. They found a dead woman, but they did not find Alice. They found Magus. His hands and feet were tied with a cloth was in his mouth. The Huron untied Magma's hands and feet. They took the cloth from his mouth. Magma was angry. "Kill the Mohican prisoner now," he shouted. "He has gone," said one of the chiefs, shouted with anger, and he ran out of the cave. 11 The old chief Magus went to the Delawares' village. The Delawares were friends of France, but they did not fight in the war. Magus went to the Delawares' meeting house. The Delaware chiefs were talking. "The Huron chief is welcome," said a Delaware. "Is my woman prisoner safe and well?" asked Magus. "She is well," said the Delaware. Then Magus said, "Are there strangers in the forest?" "White men." "There are strangers in the village," said the Delaware. "They are in my house, but strangers are always welcome in this village." "What will the King of France say about this?" said Magua. "His greatest enemy is here in Delaware's village. This enemy is a white man. He kills many friends of the French." "Which white man is an enemy of the French?" asked the Delaware chief. "The scout Hawkeye," said Magua the long gun. The other strangers were his friends. They were the enemies of France too. The Delawares started to talk quietly. One of them left the meeting house quickly. A few minutes later he came back. Then a very old man came into the meeting house. Two young Delawares helped the old man. He had long white hair and there were many lines on his face. The chief spoke his name. Magua knew the name of this famous Delaware chief. Tainund was more than 100 years old. Tainund sat down. Then he spoke to the two young Delawares. They got up and went away. Soon they came back with Alice, Cora, Duncan, and Hawkeye. Cora was very angry. She spoke to the chiefs. "Yesterday we were welcome in this village," she said. The Delawares were our friends. Today we are your prisoners. Why are we prisoners? The chief did not answer. Which man is Hawkeye the Long Gun? He asked. Hawkeye walked forward. I am Hawkeye, he said. Then Tainan spoke quickly to Magua. Take your prisoner, the dark-haired woman, go, he said. But Cora spoke to the old chief. Another man came to this village with us, she said. Now he is a prisoner too. But he is one of your own people. He will tell our story. Please listen to him. Tainan looked at the chiefs. Who is this other prisoner? He asked. He fights for the English, Magua said quickly. You must kill him. Bring him. Here, said Tamilanan. Two men left the meeting house. Soon they came back with inks. Bunks were not wearing a shirt. His hands were tied. He stood in front of Tampon. The old chief looked at him. The tenants saw a tattoo on Anus's chest. It was a picture of a turtle. The taxman looked at the ink, then he smiled at the young Mohican. Your father is a great chief, he said. Suddenly, he saw Hawker Delaware. Father, he said to Tampon, this is my friend Hawker. He is a friend of the Delawares. The Long Gun, said Tampon, he is not a friend of the Delawares. He kills our young men. Then the Hawker said, I killed Hurons, he said, I have never killed a Delaware. The Delawares believed Hawkeye's words. The Tasmanian looked at Inks. Why are you the Hurons' prisoner? He asked. I helped the English woman, said Inks. Tampon looked at Cora. Then he spoke to Magma and said, why is the English woman your prisoner? He asked. I hate the English, said Magma. Now the daughter of an English chief is my prisoner. Now the daughter of Monroe will be my wife. Magus went to Cora and held her arm. Waiting, he shouted, Duncan, don't take her. The English will give you money. But Magma did not listen. He pulled Cora towards the door. Come, he said to her. I am your prisoner, Cora said to Magus, but do not touch me. She turned to Duncan. Please take care of my young sister, she said. She kissed Alice. Then she spoke to Magus. I will come with you. And I will come too, shouted Duncan. I will help you, Cora. Wait, said Hawker. He held Duncan's arm. Hawker spoke quickly and quietly. Magma's friends are waiting in the forest, he said. They will kill you. You're on, said Inks. We will find you. We will kill you, but Magua laughed. The Mohican said, Magua, you cannot kill me. I am too strong. Stay here with your brothers, Delawares. They are weak. They like their homes and their food. They do not like to fight. They will not help you. Magua walked out of the meeting house. Cora followed him. Uncle spoke to Tainund, Delaware's father. He said, help us. We must follow the English woman. The young men of the village said, go with the Mohican. He said the Huron are now our enemies. Chapter 12, the last of the Mohicans, they walked into the forest. They walked towards the Huron village. An hour later, Hawkeye and Duncan followed Magua's trail. 200 young Delawares went with their friends. Alice stayed in the Delaware village. Hawkeye said, Major Hayward and I will find Chingachgook and General Monroe, he said. They are safe in the forest. Take the Delawares with you. Follow Magua's trail. Be careful. There will be many Huron in the forest. We will meet you at the Huron village. Magua will take Cora to the cave in the hill, said Hawkeye. We will find her. We will help her. Come, said Duncan. Hawkeye and Duncan soon found Chingachgook and Monroe. They quickly told Monroe their story. Then the four men went to the Huron village. They walked up the hill towards the cave. Suddenly, they heard shouts and cries. They looked down at the village. Hawkeye and the Delawares were fighting the Huron in the village. Then Magua and some Huron ran up the hill. They were going to the cave. Hawkeye was running after them. Hawkeye and his friends fought the Huron. The fight was terrible, but Magua escaped. Then Hawker Duncan Monroe, the Mohicans, and their friends saw Magua again. He was with another hero. They were in front of the cave. The two Indians were pulling Cora from the cave. Cora shouted at Duncan, and Cora ran towards the rocks above the cave. Cora had stopped in front of the cave. Magua took out his knife. He turned to Cora, a woman. He shouted, "Will you be the wife of Magua, or will you die?" "Kill me," Magua said. Cora replied, "I will not go with you." Suddenly, there was a cry. Uncas was standing on the rocks above them, and they looked up. The other Huron turned to Cora. He stabbed her with his knife and killed her. Magua shouted angrily. He lifted his knife and killed the Huron. Then Uncas jumped on Magua. They fought, but Magua turned quickly. He stabbed Uncas 4 times. The young Mohican stood for a moment, then he fell at Magua's feet, dead. Hawkeye saw Uncas fall. The scout ran towards Magua. Magua ran up the path. His enemies were below him. Magua climbed up the rocks, then he turned and looked down. Hawkeye stopped running. He lifted his long gun. Magua jumped towards a higher rock, and Hawkeye fired. Magua's fingers touched the rock, but the bullet from Hawkeye's gun killed him, and his body fell down and down onto the rocks. A day later, General Monroe, Duncan, and Alice stood by the graves of Uncas and Cora. They were sad and silent. Then they said goodbye to Hawkeye, Chingachgook, and the Delawares, and they walked away into the forest. Chingachgook looked at Hawkeye. "All the people of my tribe have gone now," he said. "I am alone." "No," said Hawkeye. "Uncas has gone, but you are not alone." He put his hand on Chingachgook's hand. The tears of the two friends fell. Onto the grave of Inks in 1758, General Monroe died. Alice married Duncan Hayward, and they lived happily together. From that time, the Delawares told their children the story of the English woman and the young Mohicans, and they told their children the words of Tamenund, the old chief. The time of the red man has gone. We fought for our land. But now there are many white men, as many as the leaves on the trees. I have lived too long. I have seen the last of the Mohicans.